Hello, and welcome to Ask the History Buff, the podcast that informs and educates about Canadian history. Hopefully, you will also be inspired to research some aspect of Canadian history because you heard it on Ask the History Buff. Each week, we will explore the lives of influencers, events which they influenced, and the legacy which we as Canadians have inherited because of the influence or the influencer of the events. I am Lynette, your curious Canadian history buff. I am not a degreed historian with letters behind my name, but I have researched more of our Canadian history than most people have. I am always discovering new and interesting information about Canadian history, which really excites me. And that's why I call myself the Curious Canadian History Buff. I hope that you will be encouraged to Google people's names that you hear about and the events surrounding them, like I do, just so that you can understand their impact on our society. And in the process, ask yourself these questions. Do I follow rabbit trails when I'm reading about past influencers in Canada? And for Christian listeners, do I live like a Berean, searching out everything that I hear? And if you are just too busy to search, then ask the history buff. Chances are I may have the answers. And if I don't have the answers, then I can look for them and get back to you. Feel free to challenge my information anytime by sending your questions to info@christianrootscanada.org. You may teach me something new. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the like and share buttons on this podcast. Today's topic is Christian legacies in Ontario. Toronto celebrates Simcoe Day, the first Monday of August, in honor of John Graves Simcoe. But who was John Graves Simcoe? He was a visionary, a politician, and a devout Anglican. And he laid the infrastructure of settlement in Ontario by building roads in an intentional, strategic manner. Who else was Simcoe? He was a British Army lieutenant colonel. He was the first lieutenant general of Upper Canada, somewhat like a premier. And he was the lieutenant general from 1791 until 1796, 5 short years. He had served in the British military during the American War of Independence. And that experience colored his perspective on republicanism versus conservatism or Toryism. During the American War in 1777, he was unsuccessful in forming a loyalist regiment of free black slaves in Boston. So he was an abolitionist. Soon afterwards, he was instead appointed as the commander over the Queen's Rangers. And the Queen's Rangers was a well-trained light infantry of over 300 men. He participated in other battles until December of 1781, at which time he was invalided back to England, where he convalesced at the home of his godfather, who was Admiral Samuel Graves, whose name he bore. Simcoe's father, John Simcoe Sr., was the ship captain of James Cook's ship HMS Pembroke from 1757 until 1759. Now, John Simcoe was a close friend of Admiral Samuel Graves, who became the godfather of John Graves Simcoe. At the time of his father's death, John Graves Simcoe was only 7 years old. Shortly after that, his mother died also, making him an orphan. He was then raised by Admiral Samuel Graves, and it is said that his father left a list of maxims for his education, which he referred to often. And these included giving energetic devotion to any task or endeavor, practicing devotion to duty, living and acting according to biblical standards of right and wrong, pursuing military training with a formal education, and being trained for civil as well as military appointments. Admiral Samuel Graves had a niece, Elizabeth Postuma Gwilym, whom he had also raised as an orphan. Somewhere between convalescing and getting better and returning to good health, Simcoe decided to marry Elizabeth in 1782. That same year, he was also promoted to lieutenant colonel. 9 years after his marriage, in 1791, Simcoe was appointed as lieutenant governor of Upper Canada. Elizabeth was an accomplished artist, and she painted many landscapes of Upper Canada. The town of Gwillimbury, just north of Toronto, is named in honor of her memory. Simcoe, John Graves Simcoe, and Elizabeth had 11 children. During and after the American War of Independence, there was an influx of immigrants. These were immigrants who were loyal to Britain, and they were called loyalists. Well, they came from America to Canada, fleeing north to Britain's colonies of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI, and the province of Canada, which is what Ontario plus Quebec was known as before it was separated into two provinces. Many of them were given land, chiefly in southern Ontario. So southern Ontario is a loyalist country. Before 1791, all of Upper and Lower Canada, previously called New France, that was called the province of Quebec. And in 1791, the Constitution Act in Britain divided the province of Quebec into two colonies: Upper Canada, which is Ontario, which has become Ontario, Lower Canada, which became Quebec. Upper Canada was the largely unpopulated western part of the province, and it was largely English-speaking loyalists. And the eastern part became Lower Canada with mostly French-speaking population. Simcoe, like many men loyal to Britain, held to the hope that after the American Revolution, Americans will be largely disappointed with republicanism and migrate to Upper Canada. Well, this didn't happen. Simcoe did not quite accept American independence and unity as a fact. He continued to think of the Americans only as a political threat. Toryism or conservatism versus republicanism. He did not see them as a military threat. He desired to build a Canada which functioned with the British constitutional model, but with an economic engine fashioned after American capitalism. He saw his role as developing Upper Canada as a model English society built on conservative British principles, which was superior to the republicanism of the United States. In 1791, when Simcoe arrived in Upper Canada, British garrisons still occupied border posts on the American side. Both the British and the Iroquois Confederacy, the group of natives, the Confederacy of Natives that supported Britain in the War of American Independence, they were from upstate New York. So both the British and the Iroquois Confederacy still held out hope for a native buffer state kind of thing, or a native buffer zone, as compensation for the loss of Iroquois lands in upstate New York during the American Revolution between 1775 and 1783. By September 1794, 3 years after Simcoe got here, it was thought that there would be an American invasion. The Queen's Rangers assembled in Newark, which is now called Niagara-on-the-Lake, in preparation for the attack. Simcoe's family was whisked away to Quebec to John McGill's home. And John McGill, as you would know, left his estate for the building of McGill University. Simcoe realized the need for a naval force on Lake Ontario and a garrison in Upper Canada, which would be large enough to defend both Upper and Lower Canada. Simcoe saw the control of Lake Ontario east of York, York was Toronto, as a key focus of strategic communications, resulting in the reorganization of the provincial marine instead of road development. So that's what he did. Instead of road development, he decided to reorganize the marine to help with the protection of Upper and Lower Canada. It was not until after Simcoe left Canada and not until 1799 that the building of the Danforth Road and the building of the Danforth Road did Simcoe's system inevitably point to York or Toronto as the center of the province. So let's talk about Simcoe, the visionary. Simcoe thought that it might be easy to encourage American immigration to the South western peninsula of Upper Canada so that Canada could control the commerce of the American West. He was excited by the dream of Upper Canada becoming economically important to not just the continent, but to the continent and to the empire at the time, the British Empire. If only he was alive today, he would see how important trade has become between Ontario and the rest of the continent and the rest of the world. In his mind, a land granting system which was administered efficiently and fairly would be attractive to immigrants and foster loyalty to the British government and to their new country. As with all visionaries, there were areas of disconnect between theory and practice. As a result, the actual administration of land grants had mixed success. He had planned to borrow the road building methods of the Romans also. And what was that road building method? Well, the army would set up winter quarters where the town was to be situated. Trees would be felled and the proposed settlement would be cleared. Roads would be built and the anticipated settlers would have a detachment of soldiers living among them for protection. This, of course, would boost trade since the soldiers would provide a ready market for goods and services developed by the settlers. The soldiers, in this case, would be the Queen's Rangers, who would form the nucleus of a cohesive settlement. And as new immigrants settled around them, they would all magically blend into loyal British subjects. Simcoe, the visionary, requested 12 companies of soldiers from the Governor General, but he got only 2. In spite of the smallest of their unit, the Queen's Rangers were a very important part of Simcoe's road building legacy. From their employment in June 1793, that's 2 years after Simcoe got here, until they were disbanded in 1802. They were the road builders of Upper Canada. Have you ever wondered why Quebec is so different from the rest of Canada? Why is there a French presence in Canada? And where did they come from? If you have not delved into our history from France, I almost guarantee you that you didn't know that Canada was first colonized by persecuted Huguenots, the French Protestants. At first, a small group of them were given fur trading monopolies by King Henry IV. Then, others came after Henry IV died. They fled from Cardinal Richelieu and his brutal French Catholic regime. And why did that happen? Let me introduce you to the French Connection. The French Connection is a story-based video history course linking our history to the marble frieze mounted over the left doorway of the House of Commons. It shows Francis I on the left and Louis XIV on the right. These kings also bookend stories of the persecution of the Huguenots, which started under Francis I and continued until Louis XIV, except for under Henry IV. The course covers 200 years of history, uncovering the stories of the Huguenots who established the first colonies in the Atlantic provinces, Quebec, and Ontario. This program is the first of its kind. It's chronological, explicitly biblical, with video based stories for all of the family. It traces God's providence in bringing different people together to write His story. In September 2024, we will be introducing our new additions to the course, the new student workbook and the new answer key. The workbook contains questions, quizzes, projects, essays, extra readings, supplemental videos, a final test, and so much more. You will also get 6 modules, which breaks down into 26 video stories and lesson outlines, as well as an audio version and an ebook. There are also maps and charts and timelines and photos and other extra student-only resources. So here's the steal of the deal. Compared to other Canadian history courses, you get 26 video lessons, the audio version, so you can re-listen to the content anywhere, anytime, an ebook, the new student workbook, the new answer sheet, and for homeschooled high schoolers, the equivalence of 1 Canadian history credit. Here's an extra bonus. You don't have to purchase annual licenses for each student in the same household. It's a one-time purchase deal. You have permanent access for use by all students in the same household. And here's a great deal for you. Until September 6th, all listeners get a 10% off coupon because you listen to Ask the History Buff. Just use the code HistoryBuff at checkout to get the entire course for only $270. I call that a steal of a deal. Simcoe encountered other issues because his idealism got the better of him. For example, the Constitutional Act of 1791 allocated 1/7 of the total land mass of Upper and Lower Canada as clergy reserves. This was specifically to help the Anglican Church to gain from the sale or lease of these lands. Allocation of crown lands and clergy reserves in each township, plus the zoning regulations in towns, made land grants complicated. Another problem arose when he, in good faith, granted entire townships to individuals who were supposed to organize settlers. These organizers were to become the British equivalent of the new local gentry. This had a corrupting effect on his good intentions for many years as recipients took advantage of their generous land allotments. The majority of the grants were over 500 acres in the prime location of the home district, which was around York Township, which is Toronto, and the Western District, which was all the way down to London, where most of the effort was expended at settlement. These went to favorites holding government offices. The number and size of allotments grew annually, but the system was not abandoned. Previously, in 1788, shortly after the American War, land boards had been set up to facilitate the orderly settlement of loyalists, but they were slow in land allocation. In the short term, the regulations to screen out land speculators did not work. And in the long term, there was confusion and delay in issuing legal titles. Impatiently, Simcoe sped up the process of land allocation by ordering large grants where the title was not clear, which he then used to attract settlements to specific areas. And this happened in Richmond Hill. One such grant was given to William Bercy, Berczy. His settlers built the lower part of Yonge Street, and they settled in Richmond Hill. But you can read that article on our website if you travel Yonge Street, thank a Lutheran. So go read that article. Simcoe abolished the land boards in 1794, which did not really help the situation because it destroyed the process of screening applicants. In spite of it all, he achieved the goal of making Upper Canada a place where access to land acquisition was easy for settlers. He basically had to accept settlements as they came, as opposed to the grand plan he had formulated in true visionary fashion while he was still in England. As a result, whatever settlement policies were utilized, they determined the course of the development of Upper Canada for generations, and we are reaping the benefits of his work. For himself, his military rank allowed him 5,000 acres. He judiciously spread his allocation in 1,000-acre parcels in York and Western Ontario, where his government focused its settlement efforts. So he owned land close to where he was working. In true visionary fashion, long-range planning excited him more than dealing with immediate problems. He thought that laying the foundations for the future of Canada was his most important function. He was forward-looking. He was a visionary. And he thought that that was important, his most important function, regardless of the speed of the results. This was borne out in his road building projects. He did not construct roads for the convenience of the established settlers. He thought that that was the responsibility for the local authorities. Instead, he built roads which were strategic for communications and for the future development of other settlements. In May 1793, the first road on which the Queen's Rangers began work was Dundas Street. It ran from around Burlington Bay north to probably what is now Clapperton's Corner, and it extended westwards from St. George through Paris, through Woodstock, to London at the valley of the River Thames that he had renamed the River Thames. At that time, the road actually went from nowhere to nowhere because there was no settlement there as yet. So just remember that the towns that I just pointed out, St. George, Paris, Woodstock, London, they were not established as yet. He just put the road and the development came later. Because of Simcoe's focus on strategic communications and the development of future settlements, Simcoe's original design was a road which began at the head of navigation, which is at Burlington Bay, eastwards to the center of the province, to York, Toronto. 2 years later, the road was extended east to York. It would eventually pass through the towns of Waterdown, Oakville, Mississauga, Etobicoke, Islington, and into Toronto until the Don River. Now remember, when those roads were laid down, there were no towns, no cities. And now they're huge, thriving cities. When Simcoe began to lay out the town of York, his vision was that it would become a garrison, an arsenal, and a naval base. However, Kingston became all those things because of its previous history. Again, in keeping with his vision of strategic communications and the future development of other settlements, in February 1796, the Rangers finally extended Yonge Street to the Holland River to provide strategic access to the Great Lakes. Now, the Yonge Street, if you know anything about Toronto, Yonge Street starts down by Lake Ontario and goes all the way up nearly to Lake Simcoe. From Lake Simcoe, you can get to Lake Superior very easily. Lake Huron and Lake Superior. So settlement was promoted along the road that offered security plus access from Lake Ontario to the upper Great Lakes. Simcoe's focus was on York and the western part of the province. Even though he did not give as much focus to the other loyalist settlements, which stretched from Kingston all the way eastwards to Cornwall, he accomplished in 4 years, with less technology than is available in 2024, he accomplished feats of settlement in southern Ontario, which took many more years to accomplish. So what's Simcoe's legacy so far? He fought in the War of American Independence on the British side. He wanted to form a loyalist regiment of free blacks in Boston, but that plan was thwarted. He married Elizabeth Gwilym. He was appointed to Upper Canada as Lieutenant General to lay a foundation of communications, roads, legislative, and administrative structure. He established a military in preparation for an American invasion, which did not come. He allocated land for loyalist and immigrant settlements. He constructed roads from the Thames River in London to York or Toronto on Lake Ontario. He constructed Yonge Street from Lake Ontario to the Holland River to facilitate access to the upper Great Lakes. In our next episode, we will examine the political and legislative legacy left by John Graves Simcoe. And if you want to learn more about Christian Roots Canada, check out our website at www.christianrootscanada.org. You can also find our videos on YouTube and Rumble, and our podcast on Spotify and Amazon Music. So go listen to another podcast. You will be encouraged. Bye for now and see you in another podcast.